in the heart of Riverton, a small town where everyone seems to know each other. The town has that familiar American charm, a central park where kids play after school, and a downtown area with mom-and-pop shops that have been around for decades. Life in Riverton is predictable, almost too predictable, which is why what happened at Midwood High shocked everyone. Jonathan was the kind of principal that every school wanted. In his early 30s, he was young enough to connect with the students, but old enough to be taken seriously by the staff and parents. On the outside, Jonathan seemed to have it all together: a successful career, a good relationship with the community, and a bright future ahead. But like the town of Riverton, there were things about Jonathan that didn't meet the eye. Midwood High had its share of problems, like any school. There were the usual teenage dramas, academic struggles, and occasional discipline. But overall, it was a place where students felt safe and parents felt confident sending their kids. Jonathan made sure of that. He prided himself on running a tight ship, where rules were followed and respect was. Yet, behind his polished exterior, Jonathan carried a secret that, if revealed, could destroy everything he had built. Megan Hart was a junior at Midwood High. She was one of those students who stood out, not because she was loud or popular, but because she was different. Megan was smart, almost too smart for her own good. She was the kind of student who always had her hand up in class, always had the right answer, and always seemed to be one step ahead of everyone, but she wasn't happy. Megan was struggling with things that no one else could see. She had friends, but not close ones. She was involved in activities, but never the center of attention. Megan kept to herself mostly, and when she did talk, there was a sadness in her voice that made people wonder if she was okay. But in a town like Riverton, where everyone is supposed to be fine, no one really asked. Jonathan noticed Megan early on. At first, it was her academic performance that caught his eye. She was bright, with a future full of potential. But as time went on, he began to notice more: the way she seemed lonely, the way she looked lost in thought even when surrounded by others. It wasn't long before their paths crossed more than just in passing. Their relationship started innocently enough: a conversation after school, a word of encouragement during a difficult time. Jonathan saw himself as a mentor, someone who would guide Megan through her challenges. But as the weeks went by, those conversations grew longer, and the lines between professional and personal began to blur. Neither of them planned for what happened next. They didn't plan to get involved, didn't plan for things to go as far as they did. But once they crossed that line, there was no going back. What started as a friendship quickly turned into something more, something that neither of them could control. As their secret relationship deepened, they both knew the risks. Jonathan knew what it would mean if anyone found out. He knew it would end his career, destroy his reputation, and hurt everyone around him. But he couldn't stop, and neither could Megan. They both thought they could keep it hidden. They thought they could control it. But secrets have a way of coming out, especially in a small town like Riverton. And when they do, the fallout can be devastating. Megan Hart was the kind of student who didn't fit neatly into any one category. She wasn't popular, but she wasn't an outcast either. She was smart, really smart, but that didn't seem to bring her the kind of satisfaction you might expect. At school, she was always present but somehow distant, as if her mind was somewhere else. Teachers noticed her intelligence, but they also noticed that she seemed troubled. They figured it was just part of being a teenager. Megan's home life was another story. She lived with her mom, who worked long hours, leaving Megan alone much of the time. Her father wasn't in the picture, and that was something Megan didn't talk about. The walls of her bedroom were lined with books, mostly the kind that deal with big questions: philosophy, psychology, things most people her age wouldn't touch. She spent hours reading, thinking, trying to make sense of her life and the world around her. But it wasn't enough. Something was missing, and she couldn't figure out what. That's where Jonathan came in. He saw something in Megan that reminded him of himself at that age: smart, eager to learn, but unsure of where to go next. He started spending more time with her, offering advice and listening when she needed to talk. It started with small things: an encouraging word after class, a chat in his office about her future. Megan soaked up the attention. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to notice her, to see her for who she was. As the weeks passed, those conversations became more personal. They talked about things that had nothing to do with school: her fears, her hopes, her loneliness. Jonathan listened, and he understood. He knew what it was like to feel lost, to wonder if you were on the right path. That connection, that understanding, made it easy for the lines between teacher and student to blur. Megan found herself looking forward to those talks more and more. She began to rely on Jonathan, not just as a principal, but as a friend, And then, as something more. She didn't realize how deep she was in until it was too late to turn back. For Jonathan, it was a slippery slope. He knew better, knew the risks, but he couldn't stop himself. There was something about Megan that drew him in. Her intelligence, her vulnerability, the way she looked at him like he was the only one who could save her. He told himself it was just a phase, that he could control it, but deep down, he knew he was playing with fire. The affair didn't go unnoticed forever. There was a student, someone who had always admired Megan from afar. This student was quiet, unassuming, the kind of person who blended into the background. But they saw the way Megan looked at Jonathan, saw the way she changed when she was around him, and it hurt. They had feelings for Megan, feelings that they had never dared to express. Seeing her with Jonathan was too much to bear. One day, that student decided to confront Megan. It wasn't planned. It was a moment of passion, a moment where emotions took over. They cornered Megan after school, away from prying eyes. The conversation started calmly enough, but it quickly escalated. Accusations were thrown, voices were raised, and in the heat of the moment, something terrible happened. Megan fell. It wasn't clear how it happened, whether she was pushed, whether she tripped, but the result was the same. She hit her head on the concrete, and in an instant, everything changed. The student panicked. They hadn't meant for this to happen. They hadn't meant to hurt her, not really. But now, Megan was lying there, motionless, and there was no undoing it. Fear took over. The student ran, leaving Megan behind, hoping that somehow everything would just go away. But it didn't. Megan's body was found later that evening by a janitor, and the police were called. The investigation began immediately, and it wasn't long before suspicion fell on Jonathan. The confrontation between Megan and her classmate happened on a grey afternoon, just as school was letting out. Most students had already left, and the hallways were nearly empty. Megan was heading to her locker when the classmate, someone she hadn't thought much about before, approached her. There was a nervous energy in the air, the kind that makes you uneasy without knowing why. The classmate had been carrying this weight for weeks, the jealousy and frustration growing with each passing day. They couldn't understand why Megan, someone they admired so much, would get involved with the principal. It didn't make sense, and it didn't seem fair. So they decided to confront her, thinking it might bring some kind of closure, or at least an explanation. At first, the conversation was tense but controlled. The classmate asked questions, their voice shaky but firm. Megan, caught off guard, trying to deflect, to downplay the situation, but the classmate wouldn't let it go. They kept pushing, their words coming faster, their voice growing louder. Megan felt cornered, trapped by someone she barely knew, and the pressure was too much. Suddenly, everything escalated. The classmate accused Megan of ruining everything. Her life, their life, even Jonathan's life. Megan, feeling the sting of those words, snapped back, saying things she didn't mean, things that only fueled the classmate's anger. The argument became heated, emotions running wild, and in that chaotic moment, something terrible happened. Megan took a step back, trying to get away, but she lost her footing. It all happened so quickly. Her head hit the hard floor with a sickening thud, and then there was silence. The classmates stood frozen, their heart racing, unable to process what had just happened. They hadn't meant for this to occur. They hadn't meant to hurt her, let alone cause something so final. Panic set in. The classmate looked around, making sure no one had seen. The hall was empty. They didn't know what to do, didn't know how to fix what had just happened. In a blind panic, they ran, leaving Megan lying there, motionless, as if running could somehow erase what they had done. It was the janitor who found her later that evening. By then, the school was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after everyone has gone home. The janitor wasn't expecting to find anyone, let alone a student lying on the ground, lifeless. The scene was so out of place, so wrong, that for a moment, the janitor didn't move, didn't even breathe. When the police arrived, it didn't take long for them to start piecing things together. They quickly identified Jonathan as a person of interest. After all, Megan had been seen talking to him more than anyone else. People in the town knew how much time they had spent together, even if they didn't know the full story. Rumors had already started to spread. Whispers of something inappropriate, something scandalous. As the investigation were underway, Jonathan found himself at the center of it all. He was the last person anyone expected to be involved in something like this, but the evidence was starting to stack up against him. He had no alibi, no explanation that could clear his name. And with Megan gone, there was no one to tell the truth about what had really happened. The town of Riverton was stunned. This wasn't the kind of thing that happened here. People couldn't believe that someone like Jonathan, someone they had trusted, could be involved in something so dark. But the police had a job to do, and they were determined to get to the bottom of it, no matter where the evidence led. Detective Olivia Jennings wasn't new to Riverton. She had worked in the town for years, solving cases that ranged from minor thefts to more serious crimes. But nothing had prepared her for what she found at Midwood. When she arrived at the school that evening, the scene was already buzzing with officers and flashing lights. It was clear from the moment she stepped out of her car that this wasn't going to be an ordinary case. Olivia was in her late 30s, with a calm demeanor that made her good at her job. She was the kind of detective who didn't jump to conclusions, who liked to gather all the facts before making a move. As she approached the scene, she noticed the small details, the way the hallway seemed longer, darker than usual, the way the janitor stood off to the side, visibly shaken. Megan Hart's body had already been taken away by the time Olivia arrived, but the blood stain on the floor told her everything she needed to know about how the girl. It was a hard, brutal impact, one that didn't leave much room for hope. Olivia knew this wasn't just a simple accident. There was something more to this, something that didn't sit right with her. She started by interviewing the janitor, who was still pale and shaking. He described finding Megan, the shock of it, and how he immediately called for help. His story was straightforward, but it didn't give Olivia much to go on. She needed to dig deeper. The next step was talking to the students and staff. Olivia spent the next few days at Midwood High, quietly gathering information. She spoke with Megan's teachers, who described her as brilliant but distant. She interviewed students, many of whom seemed genuinely shocked by what had happened. But as she listened, a pattern began to emerge. Everyone kept mentioning one name, Jonathan. It didn't take long for Olivia to realize that Jonathan was more than just a principal to Megan. There were whispers about how much time they spent together, how close they seemed. Some students hinted at something inappropriate, while others defended him, saying he was just trying to help a troubled student. But Olivia knew better than to take things at face value. She arranged to meet with Jonathan in his office. He looked tired, more tired than she expected. His usual confident demeanor was cracked, like he had been holding it together for too long. Olivia noticed how his hands trembled slightly as he offered her. He tried to keep his voice steady as he answered her questions, but there was something in his eyes that gave him away, a flicker of fear, maybe even. Jonathan admitted to spending time with Megan, but he insisted it was all innocent. He said he was just trying to help her through a tough time, that she needed someone to talk to. But when Olivia pressed him about the nature of their relationship, he hesitated, just for a moment. It was enough for Olivia to sense that there was more to the story. As the interview went on, Olivia began to piece together the puzzle. Jonathan's story had gaps, places where things didn't quite add up. He couldn't account for his whereabouts during the time of Megan's death, and there were inconsistencies in what he said compared to what she had heard from others. But there was something else too, something that didn't fit the usual pattern. Olivia had a gut feeling that Jonathan wasn't the one who killed Megan, but she couldn't ignore the evidence pointing in his direction. She needed more time, more clues, before she could say for sure. The town was already buzzing with rumors, and she knew she had to tread carefully. But one thing was clear. This case was far from over. As Olivia left Jonathan's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was a bigger picture here, something that went beyond just an affair between a principal and a student. She was determined to find out what that was, even if it meant digging into places people didn't want her to. As Detective Olivia Jennings continued her investigation, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Midwood High than what met the eye. The school had always been seen as a safe place, where students came to learn and grow. But as Olivia dug deeper, she began to uncover a history of being carefully hidden, buried beneath years of secrets. It started with small things, whispers among the staff, old rumors that had never been fully addressed. Olivia learned that there had been incidents in the past, things that had been quietly swept under the rug. A teacher who had been abruptly transferred, a student who had left school suddenly without explanation. These stories didn't seem connected at first, but as Olivia pieced them together, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. One of the key people in this pattern was a former teacher named Mrs. Keller. She had been at Midwood High for over 20 years before she left suddenly 5 years ago. The official story was that she had retired, but Olivia found out that there had been more to it. Mrs. Keller had known about some of the darker sides of the school, allegations of misconduct, bullying that had gone too far, and even cases of students who had been pushed out when they became too much to handle. Olivia tracked down Mrs. Keller, who was now living quietly in a neighboring town. At first, Mrs. Keller was hesitant to talk, but as Olivia explained what she was investigating, the older woman's defenses began to crumble. Mrs. Keller revealed that there had been a culture of silence at Midwood High, a way of dealing with problems that involved making them clear rather than addressing them head-on. One story, in particular, caught Olivia's attention. It involved a student who had taken her own life several years ago. The student had been involved in a relationship with a teacher, much like Megan and Jonathan, though the details had been kept under wraps. When the student's mother found out, she had tried to bring it to the school's attention, but she was met with resistance. The school administration had done everything they could to keep the scandal from going public, and eventually, the mother had been forced to drop the issue. Olivia realized that this was no coincidence. The more she learned, the more she began to see that there was a network of people at the school who were more interested in protecting their reputations than in doing what was right. This network included some of the highest-ranking members of the staff, people who had been at Midwood High for years, and who had learned how to play the system to their advantage. The deeper Olivia dug, the more connections she found. Jonathan wasn't the first principal to find himself involved in a scandal, and he certainly wasn't the only one with something to hide. The history of Midwood High was full of secrets, some of which had been buried for decades, and it was becoming clear that Megan Hart's death was just the latest in a long line of tragedies that had been covered up to protect the school's image. But there was one thing that still didn't make sense. If Jonathan wasn't the killer, then who was? And why would they go to such lengths to frame him? Olivia knew she was getting closer to the truth, but she also knew that the closer she got, the more dangerous things would become. The people who had kept these secrets for so long wouldn't let them be exposed without a fight. As Olivia Jennings continued to dig deeper into the dark history of Midwood High, she realized that she needed to speak to more people who might know something about what had happened. One name kept coming up, a former teacher's aide named Mr. Reynolds. He had worked at the school for years, but left suddenly a few months before Megan's death. Rumors suggested he might know more than he had let on. Olivia managed to track down Mr. Reynolds. He was living alone in a small, run-down apartment on the edge of town. When Olivia knocked on his door, it took a while for him to answer. When he did, he looked nervous, like he was expecting something bad to happen. Olivia introduced herself and explained why she was there. At first, Mr. Reynolds was reluctant to talk, but Olivia assured him that she was only interested in finding out the truth. They sat down in his small living room, and as they talked, Mr. Reynolds started to open up. He admitted that he had seen things at Midwood High that made him uncomfortable. He knew about the relationship between Jonathan and Megan, though he claimed he had only heard about it through whispers in the staff room. But that wasn't all. Mr. Reynolds knew about the other secrets the school had been hiding, including the story of the student who had taken her own life years ago. As the conversation continued, it became clear that Mr. Reynolds was scared of what he knew, and scared of what might happen if he spoke out. He hinted that there were people at the school who would do anything to protect themselves, and that Megan's death might have been part of a bigger plan to keep those secrets hidden. Olivia could see the fear in his eyes, and she knew he was telling the truth. Before Olivia could ask more questions, Mr. Reynolds suddenly grew quiet. He seemed to sense something that Olivia couldn't see. He stood up, walked to the window, and peered through the blinds. After a moment, he turned back to Olivia, his face pale. "I can't do this," he whispered. "I've said too much already." Olivia tried to reassure him, but it was no use. Mr. Reynolds was too frightened, and he refused to say anything more. Olivia left his apartment, frustrated but understanding the fear that gripped him. She knew she needed to keep an eye on him in case he decided to come forward later, but that opportunity would never come. 2 days later, Olivia got a call in the early morning. Mr. Reynolds had been found dead in his apartment. The official report said it was a heart attack, but Olivia knew better. She had seen enough in her career to recognize when something wasn't right. The timing was too convenient, too suspicious. Mr. Reynolds had been scared for his life, and now he was gone. The news of his death hit Olivia hard. She had been so close to getting the information she needed, and now it was gone. But more than that, Mr. Reynolds' death confirmed what she had feared all along, that there were people willing to do anything to keep the truth from coming out. Olivia's mind raced as she pieced together what she had learned. Megan's death, the old scandals, the culture of silence at Midwood High. Everything was connected. But the more she uncovered, the more dangerous the situation became. Whoever was behind this wasn't going to let the truth come out without a fight. Olivia knew she had to be careful. She was getting close to the truth. But she also knew that she was dealing with people who wouldn't hesitate to remove anyone who got in their way. Mr. Reynolds' death was a warning, and Olivia understood that if she wasn't careful, she could be next. But she also knew that she couldn't stop now. Too much had happened. Too many lives had been affected. Olivia was determined to find out who was behind all of this, and she wasn't going to let fear stop her. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. With Mr. Reynolds died and the pressure mounting, Olivia Jennings knew she had to move fast. The town was buzzing with rumors, and the police were under pressure to close the case. But Olivia wasn't ready to wrap things up until she had the full story. She knew that Megan's death, and now Mr. Reynolds' death, were part of something much bigger. It was time to find out who was really behind it all. Olivia revisited everything she had learned, going over the details again and again. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the key to solving the case was understanding the school's dark history, the pattern of cover-ups, the lengths to which people had gone to protect their secrets. It all pointed to someone who had been part of Midwood High for a long time, someone who had a lot to lose. One name kept coming up in her mind: Mrs. Patterson, the school's long-time administrative assistant. She had been at Midwood High for over 30 years, long enough to have seen everything and know everyone. Mrs. Patterson was the kind of person who kept things running smoothly behind the scenes, but she was also the kind of person who knew how to keep things quiet. Olivia realized that Mrs. Patterson was more than just a bystander. She was the one who had been pulling the strings all along. Olivia decided to pay Mrs. Patterson. It was late in the afternoon when she arrived at the small house where the neighborhood was quiet, with the sun starting to dip below the horizon. Olivia knocked on the door, and after a moment, Mrs. Patterson answered, looking surprised to see her. Olivia didn't waste any time. She explained what she had discovered, laying out the connections she had made between the old scandals, Megan's death, and Mr. Reynolds' sudden demise. Mrs. Patterson listened quietly, her expression unreadable. But as Olivia continued, she saw something change in the older woman's eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even fear. When Olivia finished, there was a long silence. Finally, Mrs. Patterson spoke, her voice calm, but with a hint of resignation. "You've done your homework, detective," she said, "but you don't understand everything." Mrs. Patterson explained that she had been trying to protect the school, to keep things from spiraling out of control. She admitted to knowing about the affair between Jonathan and Megan, and how it reminded her of the past, of another student who had been in a similar situation. That student had been her daughter, the one who had taken her own life years ago. Mrs. Patterson had tried to protect her then, but she had failed. She wasn't going to let that happen. When Megan started getting close to Jonathan, Mrs. Patterson saw the same pattern repeating itself. She feared that Megan would meet the same fate as her daughter, and she couldn't let that happen. So she began to manipulate things behind the scenes. She used her influence to keep people quiet, to make sure that no one found out about the affair. But when Megan ended up dead, Mrs. Patterson realized that things had gone too far. She hadn't meant for this to happen, but now that it had, she needed to cover it up, just as she had done in the past. But Olivia wasn't buying it. She knew that Mrs. Patterson's story didn't add up. There was still the matter of Mr. Reynolds, and the fact that Mrs. Patterson had been involved in more than just cover-up. She had been the one who orchestrated the murder of Mr. Reynolds to keep him from talking, to make sure that her secrets stayed buried. When Olivia confronted her with this, Mrs. Patterson's calm facade finally cracked. She broke down, admitting that she had felt trapped, that she had done terrible things to protect the school and her own reputation. She had crossed lines she never thought she would, and now it was all coming back to haunt her. Olivia called in backup, and Mrs. Patterson was taken into custody. As she was led away, Olivia couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. She had solved the case, but it wasn't a victory. Too many lives had been ruined, too many people hurt. But at least now the truth was out, and the town of Riverton could begin to heal. The trial of Mrs. Patterson was the talk of Riverton. People couldn't believe that someone who had been a part of their community for so long, someone they trusted, could be involved in something so dark. The courtroom was packed every day, with townspeople eager to see justice served. The atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of shock, betrayal, and sadness. Mrs. Patterson sat quietly throughout the trial, her face showing little emotion. The prosecution laid out the case against her, detailing how she had manipulated events at Midwood High for years, covering up scandals and silencing those who threatened to expose the truth. They painted a picture of a woman who had let her need for control and protection lead her down a path of deceit and ultimately murder. The defense tried to argue that Mrs. Patterson had acted out of a misguided sense of duty, that she had only been trying to protect the school and the students. They brought up her past, the loss of her daughter, and how it had affected her. But it wasn't enough to sway the jury. The evidence was too strong, and Mrs. Patterson's own confession had sealed her fate. The trial lasted for weeks, but in the end, the verdict was clear. Mrs. Patterson was found guilty of murder and conspiracy. The sentence was harsh, reflecting the severity of her crimes. As she was led away in handcuffs, there was a sense of finality, but also a deep sadness. This wasn't the ending anyone had wanted, but it was the one they got. After the trial, life in Riverton began to return to normal, though it would never be quite the same. The town had been shaken to its core, and the people were left to pick up the pieces. Midwood High, once a place of pride, was now a place associated with scandal and tragedy. Some parents even considered moving their children to different schools, hoping to leave the past behind. Jonathan, though cleared of any wrongdoing in Megan's death, resigned from his position as principal. The stigma of the affair and the tragedy that followed was too much to bear. He left Riverton shortly after the trial, hoping to start fresh somewhere far away. But the weight of what had happened would follow him wherever he went. Detective Olivia Jennings, too, was changed by the case. She had seen the worst of what people could do, but she had also seen the strength of a community that came together in the face of tragedy. She knew there would be more cases, more dark days ahead, but she also knew that she would keep fighting for the truth, no matter the cost. The people of Riverton tried to move on, but the memory of what had happened at Midwood High lingered. The school eventually reopened, with new staff and new students, but the shadows of the past were never far away. There were always whispers, always rumors about what had happened, and those who had lived through it would never forget. In the end, the truth had come out, but it had come at a price.